We're talking about the ethics of eating, so the relationship between food and ethics in various ways. But you can't talk about ethics without thinking about public ethics or the political aspect of ethical or unethical action. And so we want to say some things now and have some interviews that touch on some of the political connections between food, the food industry, food marketing, and the way in which we might think of those as political and, as a result, quasi-ethical sorts of issues. Marion Nestle is a nutritionist at NYU whom we will interview and has probably done the most to bring some of these issues about food politics to light. She has a blog, foodpolitics.org, which she runs and gets a lot of attention in the press now from people who are interested in thinking about how the food industry connects up to the way governing and government occurs. Her big entree onto the scene in this connection was a book called Food Politics, which we also discuss in the interview a little bit. And what she discloses there is, as a nutritionist, who had also had some previous involvement in government herself, is that there is a lot of money at stake in food. As you know, the food industry is often run by public companies, which have kind of stakeholder responsibilities and shareholder value to consider, and so they're looking to make money, no surprise there. As a result, though, they're going to run up against certain kind of government entities and their responsibility to legislate and to regulate, as well as up against academic entities or sort of intellectual entities whose job is really, officially anyway, just to acquire information, look for knowledge, do kind of research on foodstuffs and ingredients and the like in order to add to the storehouse of human knowledge, which can then sometimes contribute to regulatory action. And so there's this kind of interesting connection between these three main stakeholders in the overall food political situation. And Nestle describes them in some detail with some pretty amazing results. So some of the things she mentions are just the ways in which agribusiness lobbying has expanded over the last few decades to the point where we now have millions of dollars, I mean, obviously billions going into lobbying these few hundred people in Congress as a whole, but even agribusiness lobbying has gotten to be massive, where you have tens of millions of dollars going in, hundreds of millions really, if you include tobacco and dairy and forestry and so forth, into getting Congress people to do or to legislate in such a way that it's favorable to certain industries. There are recipients, as she points out, of these lobbying efforts in Congress on both sides of the aisle, and the various perks come in the usual forms, gifts and trips and sponsored this and that. The contributions to the campaigns of these officials is probably the main way in which they get direct support from the industry, but there's a lot of more subtle kind of ways of influencing them as well, as she goes into some of the somewhat disturbing details. Another interesting connection, though, is between industry and academia, in particular nutrition science. So she tells the story in the book about the way in which a lot of food science and nutrition departments are now partly sponsored, even as an entire academic department, by industry grants. And if not that, then at least a large part of the work that they do in terms of research gets sponsored by grants that are ultimately coming from industry. So there's a lot of money in the industry. There's not a lot of money in government anymore that's going to academia for this kind of research. That's being cut back as the government has tried to prune its budget. And so researchers find themselves needing to fund their graduate students and fund their research and turning to the industry for that kind of support. Nestle doesn't directly accuse any of her colleagues, former or present, of direct compromise or kind of letting themselves do the bidding of their sponsors. But she does suggest that there might be a kind of bias that is almost inevitable given human psychology and the fact that these people really need support for their work and for their graduate students. So she points out that professionals in nutrition and food science will all say, look, I'm not biased, I'm doing my thing, and nobody is ever looking over my shoulder and saying, you know, we funded this research and so you have to come out with this kind of result. And, you know, she credits that. She doesn't have too many examples of things that were much more diabolical than that or ethically questionable. But she does think reasonably that we just don't see the kind of biases, perhaps, that come from getting a lot of perks, including grants that are really lifelines for researchers from an industry, and then trying to evaluate some of the products that that industry is invested in or interested in. She also mentions that the industry will sponsor entire journals, and so you'll try to referee an article about a particular product, and yet you'll know, as the editor or the referee, that the journal itself and its entire existence relies on the good will of this corporation which puts out that product, and you wonder whether there's a little bit of bias there. There's also a lot of conferences in academia, so just as the lobbyists are sponsoring trips and golf outings for the Congress people, there's also a kind of willingness on the part of industry to sponsor conferences for academics. That's their version of a golf trip or something. So we like to get together at conferences and talk about our work, and certainly not in philosophy, but in food science and in nutrition, you get sponsorship from the very industry that you're trying to objectively and neutrally evaluate. And Nessel points out places in which that has proved to be difficult, questionable, ethically problematic. And so these are some of the ways in which food and politics interact in her book to raise certain kinds of ethical questions. All of that is not even to mention the fact that this is maybe the third thing she points out, that there's also quite a well-oiled revolving door between all of these different stakeholding centers. So you got academics going into government, government workers going into lobbyist positions. Especially the lobby government revolving door is very, very well lubricated. And so you see hundreds of people who used to be in lobbying or used to be in the industry now working in the government making the policies, and people who are leaving the government coming back into the industry or acting as lobbyists. And Nessel points out possible ethical conflicts there as well.